Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about something that's not nearly as fun as cameras and all that kind of stuff, but is much more important, as if you don't take care of your data, you will not have any photos to share or any videos to share with people. So today we're going to talk about specifically how I back up my data, as well as all of these issues going on with these SanDisk SSDs, and why I don't think it's that big of a deal overall, but only because I have these setups in place to mitigate any issues that I might run into. So if you haven't seen, there have been a ton of articles on some more mainstream kind of tech publications lately. There's been some stuff on The Verge, Petapixel, and a ton of others. You can see all over Twitter, I guess, or X, or whatever the hell they're talking about nowadays. But specifically, these SanDisk SSDs seem to be an issue with people. I know a lot of photographers that just use a ton of these, and the main issue that you're running into is a lot of people are just storing all of their work on an SSD. They're working off of it. They're using it as their external drive with no other sort of backup systems. So I want to talk about why I'm not worried about any of those issues and give you some suggestions as to how to also not be worried about those across a few different price points. So while I've actually talked before about not using these drives, I still actually do use a 4 terabyte one of these as my kind of like daily driver, I guess. The best idea would just be to buy as much internal storage as you can, but buying 4 or 8 terabytes of internal storage on a Mac is absurdly expensive, ridiculously expensive. So having a few small kind of like working drives makes all that kind of stuff way easier. Now, one of the things I learned a long time ago is that if your data doesn't exist in 3 different physical locations, you got to pretend it doesn't exist. So I think the easiest way to go about this is just finding a place in your house to store one copy, a place maybe even in your car or at a friend's house or an office if you have a detached space like I do. And then finding some sort of cloud-based system, whether you're using Google Drive or Dropbox, or even Backblaze for something like this. Now, the reason you want to use an SSD like this is because the speeds of editing and transferring files and everything like that is significantly faster than just using the cheaper, old school, actual HDDs, hard drives that are going to be a lot slower. They have more moving components. A lot more issues can kind of arise from that. So that's why most people are kind of avoiding those disks for actually working off of. But then you don't want to be just sticking all of your data on one disk like this. You're just literally asking for trouble if you're going to just put all of your stuff on something like this, because if it does fail, you could be in big trouble with clients, or you could be losing your own memories. Obviously, avoid having everything on one disk as much as possible. Probably the cheapest way to do this is to have just an external drive of some sort and use a software program like Carbon Copy Cloner to simply just once or twice a day take the information off this, sync it to another drive, so you know that if this drive fails, you're gonna lose maybe half a day or a day worth of work. Doing that on drives that are plugged into your computer allows that to then get tossed onto something like Backblaze. And then you pay the subscription for something like Backblaze overall. And then maybe you spend $200 or something like that to buy a large capacity, something like 10 terabytes of storage on a slower HDD drive that you can just use mainly as like archive, backup, all that kind of stuff. Now, I think that that can work for kind of like a entry-level budding professional. One of the things I did when I was first starting out was do that kind of backup system where I had multiple drives that had the same data on it. That way I just kind of carried an SD card case wherever I went. So it made it easy to toss in my glove box, lock it in there, that kind of stuff, and make sure I had at least the minimum backups of my current work in a separate location where, sure, I could lose some editing and things like that on it, but I had the primary files always, safe in another physical location. Now, if you have the resources, a system that I've been using for the past few years that has worked really, really well for me is to use a network attached storage device like a Synology. The way I have it set up now actually is that I have a RAID array and a network attached storage in my office here. And then I actually have another one in my basement, which is in a separate structure. I have a backyard office here where I do all my work and store many of my things, not all of them. And then I have this stuff just attached directly to the router and everything like that in my basement. So I have two separate setups that actually sync to each other, and it makes that whole setup way easier because then I have the fast setup in here, a older setup in my basement, and then anytime I just open up my computer, I can access either of those drives. And I also have it syncing to those drives as well. And the nice thing about that is it's just an automated process. My computer's open, it's on my network, I can use the internet, all that kind of stuff. I think the thing that most people run into is they might end up setting up some sort of system that may work theoretically, but if you have to go in and manually do things to back things up, I find that to be where a lot of issues happen, where you might forget to end up, sending those files over or whatever the case may be. And if you do run into sort of drive failure, most of us just assume that's not going to happen, but you have to assume that the worst is going to happen and plan for it. So I have about 15 years worth of work actually archived, as well as files that I can actually work off of in multiple locations physically. I have my working files on an SSD so that I can work more quickly off of those. And the nice thing is I can also then, if I'm traveling, I can still access all of those files, albeit a little bit slower depending on my internet connection. But then I'm not necessarily worried about something like a SanDisk drive failing or a LaCie drive failing or any other possible scenario failing. If you're using the best drive out there, at some point, someone is going to get a drive that fails. And if you don't have appropriate backup solutions, I honestly just don't think that you can call yourself a professional if you don't have those certain redundancies built into your workflow. So I'll link all of the stuff below that I'm currently using. And if you're interested, I will probably do a more in-depth video about how I actually go about transferring files, what I use to actually back up between things and systems. But as there's been so much talk about specifically these disks, I think that people jumping ship from buying, a SanDisk drive because there's a couple issues, you're sort of missing the point if you don't have other backups in place to mitigate those circumstances. So I want to make a video just talking about that and making sure people are making the, responsible and professional decisions going into those sort of things. So if you want to see my original backup video, you can check that out up here. You can check out my video on my most current NAS setup here, and I'll see you in one of those videos.